So the majority of this presentation will be focused on how to use these features, why you would use these features. But before getting into that, I thought I would do a brief intro into FME Flow, just in case someone on this call is not familiar with it. So what is FME Flow? FME Flow is a component that sits on top of FME Form. So you always have to have FME Form to build and author your workflows. And then you publish those workflows up to FME Flow. And that's how you would automate running your FME workflows. The main components of FME Flow, they allow you to automate your workspaces to run. So this could be on something like a schedule or in response to an event like a webhook. They allow you, FME Flow allows you to notify yourself or other users whether these jobs succeed or whether they fail. FME Flow also allows you to manage all your workflows. So typically when people get really accustomed to using FME Form, they have lots of workspaces they need to run and they need to manage how these workspaces are run. So FME Flow is a good way to do that so you can best use your FME resources. FME Flow also allows you to share your FME workflows. So we have these things called FME Flow apps. FME Flow apps allows you to create a no-code web app to share the workflow that you've already built. So a good example for that is, let's say you have some field workers and they need to have data that's sitting on your database. If they have access to the internet, they'd be able to run an FME Flow app and pull the data they need to be able to do their work. What does this look like? Well, FME Flow uses something called automations. So each of these components are in an automation. First, you'll start off with this green thing. This green thing is called a trigger. This will trigger when a certain event occurs. So in this case, this is the most basic FME Flow schedule. So this will trigger in response to a time arriving. Other common triggers are something like a file arriving in a directory, sending an email directly to FME Flow. We can then process that data. In response to this trigger running, you'll have these actions. These actions are these orange things. Typically, they'd be something like a workspace, but you can also log messages as they move from one component to another in your FME Flow automation. Finally, you can send out something like an email in this blue thing, which is called an external action. An external action allows you to notify another system or a resource once your work has completed. There's also lots of options if you wish to run your workspaces either in parallel or one after another. So in this case, what I'm doing right here is I'm running a workspace in parallel because it's stacked on top of each other. So in response to this FME Flow schedule, I'll run 2 workspaces at the same time. If I set up the workspaces like this, now this workspace will run after one completes. A caveat to this is you'll need more than one engine to be able to run your jobs in parallel. You can also optimize your data integration power by splitting up your workspaces. And I'll be diving more into this in the next section where I'll talk about the split merge block and how to use it. But just know you can split up your workspaces into smaller workspaces to be able to take advantage of this parallel processing power to hopefully process your data as quickly as possible. Something in the automations workflow that not everyone might notice is this little retry section. So here you can retry your workspaces upon failure. Since this is more of an advanced topic, I'll dive into this a little more now, but basically you can retry your workspace upon failure and you can use custom settings to do so. There is a bit of a caveat here where sometimes you may not want to do this. A good case of when you would want to do this is if you're connecting to something like ArcGIS Online, which historically can have a bit of just kind of like odd connection problems that we can't really solve. Like you might get a 500 error randomly. We'll retry that connection 3 times, but perhaps we just need to wait a bit before we try again. So connecting to ArcGIS Online is a really good way to utilize this retry upon failure. However, we have noticed in the past, let's say your engine crashes while you're connecting to a database, but we've already written out features to that database. In that case, you might just want an email if the workspace fails, because if we try it again, we'll try rewriting all of those records again. And perhaps you could end up with some duplicate entries, and that could lead to some issues. So typically I say if you're working with a database, you'll probably want to avoid using these settings. But if you're working with something like a web service, that's probably a good case to use these settings. I mentioned this a few times, but just so you know, you can also send emails or notification when a workspace completes, or really when anything completes in your automation. Okay, so now we'll dive into the more advanced section of what I'll be talking about. And I'll start with talking about the split merge block. So the split merge block is quite a useful feature. However, it could be difficult to understand, so I'll be talking about some of the nuances of it. So according to our documentation, the main function of using the split merge block is if you're running a group of jobs in parallel across multiple FME flow engines. So you're using the split merge block in conjunction with our queue control. You can run lots of workspaces in parallel across multiple engines. And then you can treat the running of all these jobs as either a single success or failure event. So if you're running, let's say, hundreds of jobs using automations, and you want all those jobs to produce a single, yes, this worked, or no, this didn't work event, that's when you'd want to use the split merge block. It can also help you downscale event messages. So simply adding a logger after running all of those jobs will produce many logs. However, you might want to use the split merge block because it will only ever send out a single message. So this is what it could look like. So first you have on the left-hand side here, this is the manual trigger. This manual trigger will trigger one workspace, which will produce 5 jobs. And this is done using the automation writer, which I'll talk about in a moment. But just know this one trigger will produce 5 jobs. And then from there, we'll keep running more and more of these small jobs. If I had attached an email right here without the split merge block, I would get 50 emails. That's way too many emails for anyone to process. So the reason why I'm using the split merge block is because from these 50 jobs, it will only ever produce one feature. So only ever get one email for everything that's happening inside this block. So I think the main application why I see people using the split merge block is if you're taking advantage of automations in the automation writer, and you only want to send one notification after the end of your mini workspaces. I'll also discuss why we would want to use the automation writer. Typically, I'd recommend people use something like an automation writer if they have one big job, and let's say that job is failing or it's just running too long and they want to make it more efficient. If you have that one long running job, for the most part, it will run fine. But occasionally people will say failures with it and they don't want to retry that job because it will take another long time to run. So instead, we say, okay, if you have that one massive job, you might want to consider splitting it up into smaller jobs. Kind of process that data into bite-sized chunks and use multiple engines to process that data if possible. So that's when you'd want to use the automation writer. You have one big job, maybe it isn't as reliable as you'd like. You can use an automation writer to kind of split up that job into smaller chunks, process those smaller chunks across multiple engines. Hopefully you should see a performance improvement and you'll see a stability improvement. So let's take a look at what this would actually look like. So here I have an FME workspace. In this workspace, I'm looking at collision data and I'm looking at 10,000 records. I'd like to split up this data and not process those 10,000 records all at once. So what I'm going to do here is I'll use a feature writer with this fan out functionality. And I'm going to fan out this data by the highway that we're looking at. So every single highway I have referenced in this data set will create a file. So in total here, I'm creating 19 Excel files. And now I'm using this automation writer. What this automation writer does is per feature here, I will send one message to my automation. This automation writer will contain the data from this. So in this case, I'm not sending much data through my automation writer. The only thing I'm sending is these two attributes. Let me zoom in on this. So this attribute is just my file name, so my Excel file, and how many features are in my Excel file. So I'm passing this data through because my next workspace will read in this data and process it. Let's take a look at what that looks like on my FME Flow instance. So from my FME Flow instance, I'll start from scratch here. This is my split merge block. So I have this manual trigger, which will send data or will send a message into my split merge block. From here, I have that workspace you're just looking at. And this thing down here, this is my automation writer. So what this will do is I'm utilizing this message here. This is the dataset message. This is the file that is being written out. I will read that in here, process that job, and then send information out to wherever it needs to go. So if I start this workspace here, or start this automation, trigger it, I'll see one message going in. This one will produce 19 messages. From those 19 messages, I'll only send out one log notification. And I can refresh here and see that in action. So I have 19 workspaces running here. And then I'll see only one message in my debug log that says it passes. And now typically you wouldn't have a log for this. It would be something like an email with information on what exactly passed and information on like the job statistics that ran. However, I just wanted to keep this as simple as possible. Now, kind of a tricky thing about the split merge block is if I have a single workspace that fails and it's attached to this failure port, it will send out a failure notification instead of the success notification. So no matter what happens in here, let's say 18 out of 19 workspaces run correctly, I will not have anything come out of this port. I will only have something come out of this port that says, as a group, this did not work because a single workspace failed. And I can show that off here. So in this case, I'll delete this connection. And from this success port, I'll actually connect it to this failure. And now if we start this debug log again, kick this off. What I should see now here, if I go to my debug log is I'll get a single message that said it did not pass. So you have to be really careful how you set up your workspaces here, because how you set it up and how you connect it to this action failed or action succeeded port will affect the messages you get downstream. Another important thing to note from the split merge block is it does not merge your messages together. So maybe you would expect that from this port, I should be able to see 19 messages all aggregated together, whatever I put out from my workspace. However, that's not the case. It will just send you a single message, and that's the first message that arrives. So you cannot rely on it to actually merge any information together. If you wish to merge information together, you'll have to write it out somewhere. Like you'll have to have another workspace, read in information. Let's say you want job statistics from every job that ran there. You'll have to write that information out to a temporary file, like an Excel file, and read it in another workspace. The last thing I wanted to point out with the split merge block is if you did want messages for every single workspace that ran, you can do so, but you just have to connect the action outside that split merge block. So now if I log a message here, everything that runs, I'll get messages for. So just as a quick review, the split merge block does not merge messages. It will simply output the first one it receives. The split merge block will only output one message. And if it is a failure message, that will take precedence over the success port. So you'll only ever get the failure message. You won't get anything from the success port. And then finally, you can connect an action outside the split merge block, and then you can get notifications every time the workspace runs and it isn't merged like you would expect for it to be inside the split merge block. Hopefully that all makes sense. It is a little complicated to use, but just know typically you would want to use it if you have many workspaces, typically using the automations writer. You have many workspaces that run and you only want a notification if they all succeed or if one fails. The next thing I wanted to talk about was queue control and job routing. So again, this is a bit of a trickier topic, especially since we kind of split up this queue control page. It did make it a little more complicated when you take a first look at it. So why would you want to use this queue control mechanism? Typical reasons are you'd want to control the priority of your job requests. You'd like to send your job to an FME engine that is in close proximity to a data source. So we always say, put your engine where your data is, and you get the best results and the lowest amount of latency. Also, you might want to send your FME job to a particular engine that supports a particular format. So best case example of this would be if you have ArcGIS server installed on another machine, you might want to route all your, well, you would want to route all of your Esri jobs to that machine. The applications I see most often for this is sometimes users want to reserve engines for jobs like webhooks or FME flow apps when they want quick responses. So queue control is pretty much always used when you have more than one engine. And let's say you have a lot of jobs processing on your machine and you're really using it to your max. You might want to reserve an engine for these quick running jobs, just so you can guarantee you can get a job response out in a normal amount of time. Also, you might want to set it up if you have CPU engines. So for those who don't know, CPU engines are just like normal engines, but instead of paying per engine, you're paying for the time they process the CPU. So anytime they're processing data, you will be charged for that. But what it means is you can have many, many engines running at one time. So sometimes you might see users wanting to use CPU engines as a backup if too many jobs are queuing on their standard engines. So you can set up your job routing to do so. If one of your normal queues is getting too backed up, you can have your CPU engines actually kick in, join that queue while there is a backlog of jobs. After all those jobs have been processed, your CPU engines won't be utilized anymore. I've also seen it when users have a really long running job that they want to segregate to another engine. So this can occur, let's say you have a job that takes a long time to process. Um, Perhaps more than one user will kick off that job at the same time. You don't really want that. So you might want to separate that to a separate engine. And what you're really doing there is preventing that job from taking over your entire FME flow instance. You can also, perhaps you have a job that you want to prevent parallelism on if you have more than one engine. So a good example would be if you have a job or a series of jobs writing to the same database, and you never want those jobs to run in parallel, you can use job queues to prevent that by just assigning one job to that engine. So we have a really good tutorial on how to use queue control. And so I'll take you through that and I'll show off what it looks like in the engine management page. So this is what our engine management page currently looks like. One thing you might notice is we don't actually have CPU engines on this machine, and that's because I'm on an FME Flow hosted instance. Queue control works on three basic things. You have your FME job queue that typically will be the first thing you set up if you want to start working with queue control. Here you can set the priority of the job queue. Next, you have your job routing rules. So I created one already. My job routing rule is anything that's run in the samples repository will be handled by the holding queue. And then finally, I have my engine assignment rule. So my default engines will go to, or my default queue will use engines 1 and 2, and then my holding queue will use engine 3. So when you put those rules together, now anything in the samples repository will always run using engine 3. Any of my other repositories will use engines 1 and 2 and be processed by the default queue. If you're working with queue control, you'll probably want to take advantage of this customized column setting here in the FME jobs page. In this FME jobs page, by default, let's go back to the default. You don't see the queues and you don't see what engine your job actually ran on. If you are setting up queue control for the first time, I would definitely recommend setting up these columns so you can see both the engine that the job ran on and the queue it used. And this will give you an idea of both, is my queue actually working and what queue is it using? We can test out this right here. So I have the samples job. This should use my holding queue. And that's using engine 3. So I won't dive too much more into queue control because I thought watching me set up job rules and engine rules might be painfully boring, but I will kind of talk at a high level about different queues you can set up. So you can set up queues for job priority, which you saw there. That's all based on the queue. So any jobs utilizing that queue will have a higher priority than jobs not utilizing that queue. Just a note on this, if you have lots of jobs all set at like a high queue priority, you'll still see those lower priority jobs being processed. they'll kind of slip in, and that's just to make sure that all of your jobs will eventually be processed. You can also set up queues based on job metrics. The caveat here is the job actually has to run first for us to get these metrics. So you could set up these job queues based on metrics, so based on the high CPU usage or the high memory utilization, and run them to certain engines. However, if we've never run that job before on FME Flow, we have no idea what the job metrics will actually be. So you just have to make sure you run your job once before you set up these queues, and then you can guide the job to the correct queue. This one I see people utilizing less, which is job routing based on engine priorities or engine properties. But this would be like if you're routing your job, whether it's using a standard or a CPU engine or the engine's host name or the engine resources. And then finally, I think this one is really exciting, but I haven't seen this used a lot, which is job routing based on queue metrics. So with this one, if you have lots of jobs waiting to be processed in a queue, you can kind of have like a failover queue or another queue to kind of pick up the slack. Typically, we would see this when you're utilizing CPU engines. So the CPU engines will kick in if you have a lot of jobs waiting in a queue. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to get started with both queue control and why you'd want to use the split merge block. The last thing I wanted to talk about here was a quick customer story. I looked through our customer stories and I thought most of them have already been covered in this group so far. And I didn't want to talk about a story that someone here had actually done themselves because I thought I might not be able to do it justice. But a newer one, and perhaps one you haven't seen yet, is this one from Structon Rail. They actually presented at the CityWorks conference last year. And they're using FME to automate their integration between CityWorks, ArcGIS, their ERP, and their payroll application processes, basically making sure their data integration was all up to sync and they didn't have to do any manual data entry as data moves through their system. They also created a Power BI dashboard, which displayed basically everything and how it was running on all of their railway track. So it is like a really interesting story, and we can also link out the full story if you'd like to take a look. But it's a really good use case of using application integration for a transportation use case. All right, so I'll open it up to discussion now if anyone has anything they'd like to share or any questions.
Thank you, Sienna. I'm taking a look at the chat and I do see we have a question from Paul. He said, with queues, can a single engine be assigned to more than one queue? For instance, if I have 3 engines, could I have 6 queues, or would 6 queues require 6 engines?
Yes, you can have more than one engine assigned to a single queue. And actually, a new thing that we have added in recently is you can limit how many engines can be assigned per queue. I'll see if I can pull that up. It's in the getting started documentation though. This is it. So queue limit per engine. So as of 2023, you can set up this limit. So say you only want a maximum of 2 queues per engine, you can set that up.
All right, thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I'll open it up to the group. Let's see. Yes, I've got another question in chat from Rhonda. It says most common workspace issues from the log.
Just in general around it, like the things we see most commonly wrong with workspaces in the log.
Yes. Yes, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Okay. The things I see, and it might be geared to the topics I'm most interested in. So this could be 100% biased. The issues I commonly see are number one, web connections and web services, either not being set up properly or not configured correctly, or there's just something wrong with the web service itself. So that can be kind of a tricky topic. I can link out information on using web services, but that's something I see quite commonly, especially that transition from FME form to FME flow. We really don't make it clear that it's actually best to set up the web service separately in FME flow. So users can come across those issues a lot. I also think just general memory usage issues when users are running large workspaces kind of come up quite often. Um, we do have some resources on how to best utilize memory within FME flow, but typically the recommendation is to kind of beef up your memory on the machine itself. Chris, do you have anything to add there? What's the most common workspace issue you see?
Yeah, I would agree with that. A lot of it would be skewed towards more of the connections, but I'm just typing out a couple of guides that we have access to for troubleshooting, like FME troubleshooting guides. They're available for both FME form as well as FME flow. So that walks through more or less all of the common issues that we see with workspaces. So be sure to take a look at that link. And if you find that you're running into any of those issues, and if it isn't resolved by any of the articles, absolutely feel free to reach out to us. Or of course, if you are running into any other issues, please do not hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Sienna and Chris. Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to post them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, raise your hand. Thank you so much, Sienna, for that presentation. That was really interesting and helpful. I know a couple of my colleagues are interested in automations, and so we'll find this very interesting. I've recorded this presentation and I will email it out after the meeting as well if you guys want to share it with anybody. All right, well, I'm not hearing or seeing any further questions, so thanks again, Sienna, for presenting. I just wanted to touch quickly on getting some feedback as far as how the working group meetings are going so far. It's been a little over a year since we started up these meetings. They've gone really well so far. I want to thank everybody who has presented at the meetings. We're always looking for presentations, so if you are interested, please feel free to shoot me an email and we'll get you on the schedule. So I sent out a survey a couple of days ago. I've got a few responses as far as how the meetings are going so far and where folks would like to see the meetings go in the future. I'm going to share that link in the chat. I got about 5 responses and I just got a notification that I got 1 more response. So before sharing any results, I'd like to share the link with y'all and encourage you to take that survey if you're interested. So far, the responses have kind of agreed that the quarterly schedule works for most people. We got 1 person saying that they'd like to see meetings more often, but the majority say quarterly works for them. I asked about if folks were interested in more technical or detailed presentations, and most people responded in the affirmative that they would like to see more technical presentations. However, I did get some feedback that folks still like to see use cases from organizations on how they're using FME related to roads and highways or roadway data in general. And I don't want to narrow it down to, you know, one particular topic. So definitely more use cases would be welcome for sure. And I got a kind of a mix of responses as far as whether or not people wanted high level presentations or more detailed. I think people want to see a mix. I think our group has a lot of folks who are brand new to FME, but we have folks who are kind of more experienced as well. So having that mix, I think, would be good as well. Jolene, I see you posted in the chat that if we're interested in a personalized session on FME, feel free to contact you at your email address. So check out that chat, you guys, if you're interested in a more personalized session, because you know you can see the folks from SAFE obviously know what they're doing and give great presentations. So definitely reach out to Jolene if you're interested in that. So now I'd just like to open it up to everyone. If anyone has any issues, questions, comments, feedback about the meetings, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat, or just feel free to take that survey at that link. I think that would be helpful. All right, well, it's a kind of a short meeting this quarter. If nobody has any questions or comments, we'll go ahead and wrap things up and hope to see you at our next quarterly meeting. Thank you very much.